This is Israel, and there's a place here that looks like a glitch on a map. Look, desert, parched ground, and what's that green blot? Let's zoom in, and it's a forest. It even has a name, Yatir. But how did a forest end up in the middle of a desert? Usually the answer is simple. Plant trees, bring in seeds, irrigate. They did that once, but doing it constantly is slow, expensive, and basically unrealistic for a desert. So what did Israel do instead? It grows and maintains the forest without planting new seeds or new trees. Now I'll show you the bizarre method. See what this massive machine is doing? It's ripping trees out along with their roots. It looks brutal, like they're actually destroying the forest. But this is where it gets interesting. The Israelis did it on purpose. It was an operation the forest actually needed. Without it, the trees started to die. And here's the key. That cruel step triggered an effect that made the forest expand, not shrink. How big was the scale of it? Huge. Not dozens or hundreds of trees, hundreds of thousands. As today, there are about 1 million trees growing out there in the desert. Yes, all of it happened because Israel aggressively cut into the forest and didn't rely on seeds. How's that even possible? You're about to find out. The most important forest in the world. So what do you think of the idea of growing a forest where a forest has no business existing? Not planting a few trees along a road, but creating a real forest right on the edge of a desert. It sounds insane. So why did Israel do it? By the 1960s, it was becoming obvious that the Negev desert was creeping north, and Israel didn't have much fertile land to spare. This wasn't about making things greener, it was about territory. Where would agriculture survive? And where would healthy soil remain if the sand kept pushing forward? The solution was bold. Put a barrier in the desert's path. Not a concrete wall, but a wall of trees. The idea was that roots would bind the soil, slow erosion, and help the ground retain moisture. In other words, make the desert run into life instead of loose sand. Did it work? Absolutely. Along the Negev's northern edge, a green wall appeared, about 15 square miles, planted mostly with drought-tough Aleppo pine. This wasn't decorative landscaping, we're talking roughly 4 million trees. And the strangest part is that it genuinely held the line. At that point, the story could have ended as a clear success, but instead the forest became a global-scale problem, because nature seems to be correcting the mistake. In severe drought years, 5 to 10% of the trees in Yatir can die, and in some areas, losses exceed 80%. This isn't old age or disease. Studies point to extreme water stress. The trees are literally dying of thirst. In other words, the forest that was supposed to stop the desert has started to lose. So how do you repair a forest that's living right at the edge of its resources? The answer seems obvious. If trees died, plant new ones. But in Yatir, that approach is doomed. Here's why. A young tree is a vulnerable tree, even a drought-tough pine. It needs resources, water, nutrients, and space. And all around it are mature trees that already control everything. The result is absurd. You try to restore the forest, but the seedlings can't survive because the forest has already claimed whatever could have saved them. And that's where Israel arrived at a solution that sounds completely insane. To save Yatir, the country began to remove trees. Destroying to protect. Let's start with the key question. Can you really save a forest by destroying part of it? It doesn't seem to make sense. You planted trees in a desert, protected them for decades, and now you roll in with machinery and start removing living trunks? But that's exactly where Israel ended up. Because during drought, the Yatir forest doesn't decline little by little, it collapses in big patches all at once. So what's going on? The thing is, in a desert, what matters isn't green biomass, it's water. And when a forest becomes too dense, every tree turns into a competitor that sucks the soil dry. In an average year, the system can hold together. But when a serious drought hits, competition becomes a death sentence. Trees start dying en masse. This is precisely where thinning changes the equation. The whole idea in one sentence, for the forest to survive, it needs fewer trees. So the solution is simple and brutal. Remove part of the stand selectively so the remaining trees get more water, nutrients, and light. How does that work in practice? Like this. With fewer trees, the forest behaves differently. The survivors grow faster and experience less water stress, and most importantly, the forest stops acting like one continuous blanket. Thinned areas develop an understory, gaps open in the canopy, the microclimate shifts. It sounds great, except for one catch. Thinning isn't some magic, it only works at the right dose. Too little intervention changes almost nothing, Too much makes the forest vulnerable. In other words, thinning is its own science. You have to know exactly when, where, and how much to remove, otherwise you can lose the forest for good. So yes, Israel has figured this out. The country learned how to keep a forest alive without planting a single new seed. Sounds like this is it, the universal solution. But can the forest manage on its own without people? Future of the forest. So people are doing everything they can to keep the forest alive, but it can't really survive on its own. Yatir barely regenerates naturally. You can keep it standing with thinning, and you can try to boost its resilience to heat and drought, but new trees aren't coming in at scale. Either seedlings don't appear at all or they die off quickly. In other words, the forest is turning into a no next generation system. And then what? Then comes the unpleasant part. Most of Yatir's pines were planted in the 1960s, which means many of them are now roughly 50 to 60 years old. That's the age when trees start losing stability, growth slows, crowns thin out, and heat and drought stress hit harder. The math is simple. If new trees don't take hold, then in the next 10 to 30 years, the forest will begin to break apart on its own. Gaps will open up, and every new dry year will widen them. So what do Israelis do? First, they try to keep water where it falls. In Yatir, they build terraces to collect and slow down rainwater runoff so the soil holds moisture longer, the old trees suffer less, and any potential seedlings have a better chance. But there's another twist. They want to change the forest itself, because the second strategy is to replace part of the forest's vulnerable profile. The idea is to shift towards species and shrubs with deep roots, plants that handle heat and drought better than Aleppo pine. So it's no longer save the pines, but reprogram Yatir, turn it into a tougher, more stable ecosystem. And here a problem pops up that sounds almost ridiculous, but in practice can wipe out any planting effort: goats and sheep. They're deliberately released into Yatir, and that's helpful. Grazing animals eat dry grass and undergrowth that would otherwise become fuel for wildfires, but at the same time, they do something else. They browse young shoots, seeds, and shrubs trying to grow under the pines. So the forest isn't failing to renew itself only because of climate. Animals are also preventing it from growing back. That creates a closed loop. To keep the forest from burning, you need hoofed grazers, but for the forest to regenerate, you have to protect young growth from those same grazers. And if Israel launches a large-scale program to change the forest's composition, planting shrubs and new species, then the animals automatically become threat number one. So what's the end game? Yatir's future looks bleak. You can hold it together and keep patching it up, but it remains a forest that nature doesn't really want there. The system keeps trying to erase it through drought, aging, and competition for water, and every year Israel is forced to face the same question. How do you stop a desert forest from disappearing when the price of constant human control becomes too high? The answer is, ask China how. Coming back after centuries. We're leaving Israel and heading to China. It might sound like a weird detour, but it's worth it. This is the Loess Plateau, a vast region in northern and central China that stretches across several provinces. So what makes it special? A long time ago, this wasn't a dry, dusty highland. Nearly half of it was covered in forests and steppe vegetation. Not scattered green patches, but a continuous belt roughly 125 to 250 miles wide and about 247,000 square miles in area. In terms of scale, that's about the size of France. How do you even destroy a landscape the size of a country? The answer is simple and terrifying. Forests get cut down for fuel and building materials. Farmland keeps expanding, even onto steep slopes that were never meant for crops. Livestock grazes and tramples whatever vegetation is left holding the soil together. It doesn't look like a disaster of the day, it looks like everyday life. And that's exactly why it doesn't stop. By the 19th century, only about 4% of the original greenery remained. And that was just the beginning. Once the roots and grass cover were gone, the soil had nothing protecting it. Rain stripped away the top layer, wind carried it into the valleys and into the Yellow River. Year after year, the damage built up and huge areas turned into raw, eroded voids. So the real question became, how do you restore a country-sized region after centuries of destruction? You can't just plant some trees, the scale is too massive. This would take a coordinated intervention. The breakthrough wasn't a single project, it was a system. Anti-erosion and revegetation efforts began back in the 1950s and 60s, but the campaign truly picked up pace in the 1990s. China realized that scattered plantings were pointless when an entire landscape had collapsed, so they came up with a full package of measures, almost like engineering repairs for land. Slopes were shielded with shelter belts and new plantings. Gullies were terraced, literally carved into steps so water couldn't build speed and rip soil away. Small reservoirs and irrigation systems were added, but what about grazing, one of the biggest drivers of the damage? This is what China did. Livestock that used to roam freely on the slopes was simply kept out. The government imposed grazing restrictions across parts of the lowest plateau. All of this sounds great on paper. In reality, conditions on the plateau are brutal. Steep slopes, collapses, massive gullies where one mistake can trigger another round of destruction. So the only question that mattered was, did it actually work? Well, let's see. Since the late 1990s, roughly 10 million acres of degraded land have been converted into forests, shrubs, and grasslands. But the key point is that the greenery didn't just appear, it held. Erosion also declined. Across about 34% of the region, soil loss slowed down. And now we can circle back to Israel, because that story lands differently. Yes, Yatir is tiny compared with China's plateau, but the struggle's the same. The land wants to become desert, and humans have to hold it in place with deliberate effort. China and Israel can pull it off because, well, they're China and Israel. But you know what? There's a country that isn't famous for high tech, doesn't project engineering superpower vibes, and yet it managed to restore 865,000 acres of dead land. Billion tree tsunami. This is Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. The forests here have been slashed to the bare minimum, and the soil's being eaten away by severe erosion. In short, it's a textbook example of what dead land looks like. And this is the same area just 4 years later. Pakistanis planted more than 1 billion trees, transforming about 865,000 acres of formerly barren territory. And this is a country that lives with chronic budget shortages and constant political turmoil. So why did Pakistan do it? The answer's simple. For Pakistan, this was never a green campaign, and it definitely wasn't a feel-good story for glossy reports. It was about survival, in the literal sense. Pakistan is often ranked among the countries that could be wiped out by climate change. Why? Himalayan glaciers are melting faster than normal, and instead of steadily feeding rivers, that water crashes down as floods, washing away cities and roads. The country has shockingly little forest left, only about 2 to 5%. That's just the beginning. Without a protective belt of trees, the land stopped holding water and shade basically vanished. Cities began recording temperatures above 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Farmers watched their livestock die of thirst on cracked soil where something used to grow. So what do? The plan was brutally straightforward. Either Pakistan plants trees now, building a living barrier against floodwater and extreme heat, or tomorrow the country gets burned or drowned for good. In 2014, the Billion Tree Tsunami program began. The government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa immediately pulled a bold move. Instead of buying saplings from huge corporations, it awarded contracts to ordinary people. Thousands of small home-based nurseries sprang up across the province. For many families, it became the only way out of poverty. Women and older people grew trees right in their own yards, and the state guaranteed it would buy them back. But just when it seemed like everything was going smoothly, a problem emerged that was even more frightening than climate change. For decades, the country's forest resources had been controlled by powerful networks that had no intention of giving up their profits for some green future. And once the program started gaining traction, they began issuing threats and even using violence. For example, several forest rangers were killed while trying to stop illegal logging and protect the new plantations. So how do you make a system work to save a nation under conditions like that? The government took an unprecedented step. It granted forest officers police powers and brought in army units to patrol. That turned an environmental initiative into a full-blown security operation. Did it work? 1 billion trees were planted. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa was transformed almost beyond recognition, becoming an enormous new forest. So lush and green that locals could barely believe it was the same place. But across Pakistan, people also understood that one program wasn't enough. One province had been rescued while much of the rest of the country remained an environmental disaster zone on a staggering scale. So what's Pakistan doing about it? Well, the simplest, and at the same time the hardest answer, is this. Pakistan decided to scale up the Billion Tree Tsunami. In 2018, the country unveiled a follow-up initiative, the 10 Billion Tree Tsunami. This time, the effort would go beyond Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and expand across all of Pakistan. It sounds incredible, but it's also far more ambitious than 1 billion trees. Is Pakistan able to handle a challenge that big? Well, the country hasn't reached 10 billion trees yet, but as of 2024, it's already planted more than 2.2 billion. No, the target hasn't been met, but that's still a massive number, enough to reshape the country. And yes, it takes an enormous amount of time and effort. But what if we told you there's a way to make it much easier? For example, by creating a rain of future trees. Tree rain. This is Kenya, a country that loses about 200,000 acres of forest every year. Vast swaths of green are vanishing from the map. Is no one trying to bring it back? Of course, Kenyans are trying to save their land, plant seedlings, scatter seeds, but large-scale recovery still doesn't happen. Too few plants survive. So who or what is eating Kenya's green future? The reason's both simple and brutal. In Kenya, survival is almost a gamble for a young tree. The sun bakes the ground until it cracks. The soil loses moisture fast, and rain comes rarely and without warning. Even if a seed makes it into the earth, the race begins. Can it grow roots before the next dry spell hits? If not, it's over before the first leaf appears. There's no later and no just a bit more time here. One small delay can cost a plant its life. And if drought doesn't finish it off, the helpers move in. Birds dig up seeds, rodents drag them into burrows, and goats and antelope strip young shoots down to nothing. For the ecosystem, that's normal. But for reforestation, it's a disaster. Each new sprout isn't a future tree, it's an easy meal. And so Kenya's future forest disappears not because of one big catastrophe, but because of thousands of small, everyday defeats. Yeah, it may not look that dramatic at first glance, but the numbers are grim. If things keep going the way they are, Kenya could lose 49 to 55% of its forest and vegetation cover by 2040. So how is the country trying to get out of what feels like a no-win situation? Well, one approach looks almost sci-fi. Seed balls dropped from airplanes. They look like tiny black pellets about the size of a pea. Inside are seeds of native trees and grasses. Outside is a protective coating made of biochar mixed with nutrient binders. But why is this better than planting seedlings or scattering seeds the usual way? The thing is, the coating does several jobs at once. It helps protect the seed from hungry birds and rodents, as bitter, rock-hard biochar makes the pellet unappetizing. It also reflects excess UV light and keeps the seed from overheating, acting like thermal protection. And thanks to the charcoal's porous structure, the pellet holds moisture so the seed can sleep for months until the rainy season arrives. Once the soil gets wet, the coating becomes a tiny nutrient capsule that feeds the seed's roots during those first critical days of growth. Sounds great, but it must be expensive, right? Kenya isn't a particularly wealthy country. Rent, fuel, and pretty much everything else are major expenses, and for a large share of the population, there isn't always enough food to eat. Still, seed balls can beat traditional planting methods, and here's why. Seedball's Kenya project tested aerial seeding under local conditions and estimated that using airplanes and helicopters costs about $30 per 2.5 acres. Planting seedlings by hand, meanwhile, can run around $1,000 per 2.5 acres. Feel that gap? It's huge, but even $30 per 2.5 acres is still a heavy burden on a national budget because you'd need to spread seed balls across an enormous area. So can we cut costs further? Yes, because seed balls aren't tied to aircraft. You can spread them from anywhere. One person with a slingshot or even just tossing them by hand can cover several thousand square feet in a day. And if you bring in local volunteers and school children, you can distribute millions of seed balls quickly with minimal expense. Even after paying wages or small compensations, the cost can be dozens of times lower than using aircraft. A simple trick, but a powerful one. And if this method is basically perfect for Kenya, how widely is it actually used? How about 60.5 million? Only Seed Balls Kenya has distributed this much since 2016. There's also information that the Kenya Forestry Research Institute has distributed about 18 million more with help from businesses, government agencies, schools, and ordinary people. In short, this isn't some exotic restoration trick anymore. It's become a mainstream practice in Kenya. But what if planting could be even easier? For example, with no human involvement at all. That's not science fiction anymore. Technology safeguarding nature. Take a look. A tracked box rolls out of a truck and travels across huge areas with no human control. After a while, you start to notice seedlings. Then later on, full-grown trees. So how does that box pull it off? For starters, it's not a box at all. It's an autonomous planting robot co-developed by Continental Engineering Services and Land Life. The robot drives itself over degraded land, scans the terrain, and physically plants seeds in the soil. And it doesn't just toss them out. The robot clears each spot of dry grass, drills a small hole to the right depth, drops in a seed, and covers it back up with soil. On average, you can plant about 60 seeds an hour, each one at the same depth and with solid soil contact. That's crucial in dry regions. The seed isn't left on the surface to overheat, and it's less likely to be snapped up by birds or rodents. Yes, 60 seeds an hour is painfully slow compared with traditional methods, but sometimes planting well matters more than planting fast. The robot's downside is obvious. This kind of work doesn't come cheap. Details are still scarce, but experts say a single robotic helper could cost up to several $100,000. Which raises the big question, does a solution this expensive have any real future? Only if you treat it as a mass market tool, but as a specialized one. There's no point sending one autonomous robot out into the field to cover thousands of acres. It's easier, faster, and cheaper to scatter seeds or seed balls by hand or from the air. Where this robot does start to make sense is anywhere the cost of a mistake is too high. High-value sites, post-wildfire zones, areas near water sources, steep slopes where erosion strips away soil, or places where every single tree is an anchor for the ecosystem that'll follow. So no, this isn't a solution for countries like Pakistan or China that plant millions of trees at scale, but for Israel it could be perfect. The culture embraces high tech, and the Yatir forest demands a more tailored approach.